Hello, everybody. So this is really about Peter's time. I'm going to be sort of asking questions and kind of guiding the conversation, but it's really for you all to get to hear from Peter, who has some really, really interesting information to talk to you about regarding the nature of NHI and some of the philosophy and ontology behind the whole thing. But we just want to start, Peter, first by just talking more broadly about, the fact that the Sol Foundation has been working a lot on government policy, but it also incorporates academia into its roster of what's really important. And so maybe you could just share with everybody the role that academia plays, or should play, maybe even more in this whole journey as you see it and as Sol sees it.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie, and thanks again for being here, everyone. I think the most concise way to address that question is to reflect for a moment about the congressional hearing that just happened on the House Oversight Committee on UAP. You can look at the footage of that hearing, and what you see in very dramatic terms is that the questions raised by what I'm going to call the UAP presence. We know that UAP are here. We know they're here in certain numbers, which are just not one or two, or that you could count on your hand. That presence raises a lot of it raises a lot of wonder for us. We ask a lot of difficult questions about it, but we don't have a lot of expertise in any field or any institution that can easily answer those questions. Now, within government, I think intelligence people are actually very suited to thinking about UAP because they have to deal with problems that aren't quite scientific, they're not social scientific, you need immediate results. And I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the best minds we have on UAP are scientists who have worked in US intelligence. It's not just that they were exposed to information there that the general public doesn't have. They were able to apply intelligence analysis and a scientific approach to it, to the information they had. And you're not going to find that from a lot of academics. What academics can do, though, is we know how, with new and emergent problems, to step right up to them, examine them, and figure out which part of a problem or what kind of a problem we can actually shed light on. Sometimes you can't do a lot because you don't have fields of knowledge that are suited to a problem, but sometimes there are aspects of a problem, be it scientific, social scientific, something general for government, or even for a tech or VC field, where academics really can say, look, yeah, we have methods to address the following issue. And what we can do is we'll do it with a certain kind of intellectual responsibility. Part of our vocation is, the condition of being an academic and taking that as your vocation is you're going to feel on the line about what's true and false. I mean, that becomes intrinsic to you. And different kinds of academics have different relationships to truth. It's much harsher for a scientist. It's like it's stark, true or false. In the interpretive sciences, which I come out of, you have a lot more flexibility, but you're still looking at you want to say true things about facts, you want to have a truthful relationship to principles, and you want to be intellectually honest. So what we hope to do with Sol, in as much as it's a hybrid academic and policy institute that's also looking towards a private sector for partnerships, is we want to take an academic ethos to the UAP issue so that what we don't do is actually regress rationally and intellectually in the way that our times are tending to when we're faced with something so anomalous. It's not going to make a lot of sense for us to call for disclosure, to call for a general public discussion about UAP, and then confine ourselves to podcasting, to our own private musings at home, to as great as they are, nighttime discussions over or drinks or a fire in which we let our imaginations go, we want to always come back to some kind of position in which we're sober about evidence, even as we're stretching our minds as far as they go, because we're dealing with something that is almost unfathomable to us.
And so with respect to the movement of, that we all call disclosure, I mean, can you say more about how the Sol Foundation thinks that's going to happen, should happen? What kind of role can you play in making that happen? And how do you see, what does disclosure actually mean? How do you see that happening?
Yeah, I'll speak for myself because Sol has a lot of stakeholders. There are a lot of people internally, Jonathan, Mara, Gary and I, Tim Gallaudet, and I think we need to work towards formulating something like a policy proposal about disclosure. I don't think disclosure is as simple as a grand revelation of truth about history or about the UAP presence said in a Hollywood style by a president in a special press conference. I think it's a much more midterm to long-term process in which it's small incremental steps that come when people in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, even in scientific fields, acknowledge what they know, often what they know through secrecy oaths and exposure to classified information, but also that they work to verify what they know. We've seen tremendous progress in the last 5 or 6 years, and a lot of us get demoralized because the world hasn't suddenly bowed down before what we've said is true and accepted it. But we're dealing with something that is so outside our framework, so outside our cosmology, so outside our ontology, that we may not want disclosure to happen overnight. Not just because it's going to be shocking or destabilizing for some people or some institutions, but we want to have space to absorb this, to reflect on it, and to actually understand it. I think right now, we have such a low ceiling on what we understand about the few facts we have that were we suddenly to get a barrage of facts, I'm not sure that anyone would be able to make sense of it. So again, that comes back to why we need, I think, a subtle intellectual approach to the issue. But also with government, we want to think about what the real stakes of this are. It's not just about the UAP presence and understanding who we are as human beings if there are so-called non-human intelligences. We have a real problem with governance of the UAP issue in the US government. The legislative branch has been cut out for 80 years of one of the most significant things the US government deals with. So it's not just that the public has been neglected and in some cases lied to, it's that the branch of government that is the most responsive to people immediately has nothing to do with the issue. And there are constitutional legal issues that come up with that. And I think we should be working towards disclosure because we actually want democracy on this, not just truth.
Right, and so I know that you wrote a white paper about secrecy, and that maybe secrecy is a little more complex, or the need for secrecy might be more complex than people feel. So do you want to comment on what your ideas are about that?
Yeah, I want to say a word about that. Before I get to that, I should say what I think the issues are for Congress. Imagine that a lot of its constitutional responsibilities, it hasn't been able to fulfill them for decades when it comes to the UAP issue. Real simple example of this is the Senate's advise and consent process with presidential nominees for cabinet level positions in intelligence, defense, energy, other areas, maybe the State Department, where if UAP are real in the way we know they are, and if there really is secrecy in the way that we're all but certain there is, the Senate has never known to ask a question about this to a CIA director or a Secretary of Defense. It's only in the last years that it's kind of dawned on some people in the Senate that, we need to be doing that when we have people coming in here for the confirmation process. But there are many other issues like that. Congressional oversight of the Intelligence Committee, authorization of spending, the annual passage of defense and intelligence legislation. All of that needs to be something that factors in UAP, and Congress has to be on top of that as an issue so that they can actually govern. This shouldn't just fall to the executive branch. But that makes it seem, to come to your question now, that we should just have a complete end to the secrecy. Now, I'm going to be critical of that idea, not because I am thinking about the interests of the executive branch or especially the intelligence community on this, because I think some blame has to be laid on them for extreme, even obscene secrecy. But we don't know why this is a secret. There are people, public figures, non-public figures, who know infinitely more than me about this, and an immense amount about what's known by the U.S. government. And they will tell you, we aren't sure why this is a secret. We can't always wrap our heads around it. There may be some facts that would be so disturbing that we might learn that the decision for secrecy that extreme might have been justifiable. So in unpacking what's happened in history that's led to the secrecy being in place and figuring out how to have a disclosure process, I think we should all step back, reflect, and think about how quickly we want the process to go, but also imagine if you had to take responsibility for it, would you feel good letting information out to the general public that could be extremely disturbing? I don't know that something like that is there. I have suspicions about it being there or not being there, but that's all beside the point until we know. So I just think there's some cautions we should keep in mind with secrecy.
Yeah, I mean, some people have suggested that the NHI themselves may have something to do with it, or may have something to do with being more in control of things than we might imagine. Is that something that's crossed your radar at all?
That's not the kind of possibility I want to comment on directly, as if we could know that. What I do want to say, though, is those kinds of questions are vital to ask, even if we can't answer them, because just like the UAP presence, if you accept the Nimitz incident, or you accept one very well-researched and vetted case in which a UAP vehicle was seen in clear daylight by multiple witnesses, doing remarkable things, you automatically have to accept that there are many, many more UAP, and you start to have to think about what the general numbers are. Well, once you accept there's a UAP presence in that sense, you start to have to ask questions like this, because we're either dealing only with the designers of the UAP, who could be remote and not present, or we have to ask if there are operators. And if there are operators present, then this sort of question becomes something we have to ask. I just don't think we have enough analyzable, interpretable facts that taking a gander at that question publicly is responsible.
I completely agree with you. I just couldn't resist. So now do you want to move more into the ontology question here? Because, Peter has studied, he's a specialist in this ontology, basically, as an anthropologist. And as John Mack has stated, what he calls ontological shock, that our notions of reality are really threatened by this or changed by this. Do you want to move into a discussion about what that means? And we can examine the phenomenon through that lens a little bit more.
Yeah, by all means. I'll shift gears a bit and talk to you not about non-human intelligence, but about human beings and human intelligence. Ontology, until recently, is mostly a field within philosophy that concerns how we think about reality at all, and often under the rubric of just being, or the fact that there is something rather than nothing, as it's framed in philosophy. In anthropology, many of us became, about 15 years ago, very interested in thinking about how human beings have different ontologies, different general conceptions or understandings or pictures of reality. Because when we did that with certain special cases, it was often indigenous thought in the Amazon, sometimes classical Chinese thought, and its outgrowths like Chinese medicine. We were able to see that the entire way human beings organize their lives, their societies, and their thinking are governed by very different ideas about reality than our own. And I don't mean our own alternative ideas about reality. I mean ideas about reality that are so weird to us, they might as well belong to so-called aliens. A case in point is, again, the Amazon, where even today, you have many indigenous peoples who work with a sense of reality that's the inverse of our own. Instead of imagining that reality is mostly composed of non-sentient things that are material, physical, and are objects, and the main exception to that is the human mind, human selfhood, and human subjectivity. They imagine a world in which, or they treat the world as a place that's just full of subjectivity, full of selves, full of consciousness, full of intentionality. And they attribute that to a variety of beings and almost all beings. Things that would be purely objective or purely thing-like are very rare. Just by studying that in anthropology, we were able to get a better picture of how we, as descendants of European thought and around the 1600s, we understand our notion of reality better by contrast. We are fairly miserly about ascribing subjectivity to anything else but human beings and a few animals. And we imagine the entire universe is dead, inert, and full of only things and not consciousness. Now, just having that kind of contrast as an anthropologist, in which you can see that in one theory of reality, we have a lot of subjectivity and almost no objects, and in the other, we have a lot of objects and very few subjects. That can help us understand the UAP presence. In short, I think that we've gotten kind of stuck in how we think about UAP, where we either attribute to them too much objectivity or too much subjectivity. On the one hand, we study them as we need to if we're doing science, using instrument data, quantitative data, or very refined qualitative data. And then we're looking at things that are clearly vehicles, but we're only thinking about them technologically. On the other hand, when we start to think about all the strange noetic phenomena, mind-to-mind phenomena that apparently accompany UAP, certainly that's what comes up in the reporting, we start to imagine that the designers, or maybe the operators of UAP, are something like super subjects or super selves. And in the one case, we assume we're the subjects and we're studying objects. In the other case, we assume that we're the objects, so inferior to these great selves who are almost godlike to us that we could barely study them, barely understand them, and we even ascribe to them powers to deceive us or manipulate us with the so-called phenomena that would make it impossible for us to have agency in relationship to them. I would propose that we do something in between, and we assume that there's a self-to-self relationship, and that instead of just trying to study an object or another self, we study a relationship and think about a relationship between two selves in which we're one pole of that relationship, and human beings are selves in the interaction. And I think when we do that, a lot of data that we've neglected, a lot of reporting data, narrative data, qualitative data, it suddenly emerges and we can see it in a new light and we can learn new things about UAP and maybe whoever designed them.
Yeah, and to take it further, I mean, you talk about, within that relationship, you talk about some kind of communication. Is there communication going on between, let's say, NHI and humans? And how do you frame that communication? How do you see it? Because I think we're not just talking about conversations here. We're talking about another type of communication where what they do actually is giving us a message. So, I mean, I think that's how you see it. And you can talk about how you would see that sense of communication.
I think that's a great question, and that might seem a bit shocking to some people that we would dare to kind of talk about that. But if we take this framework, which is a hypothesis or a theory or just a kind of interpretive direction, and we assume that we're looking at a relationship instead of just something that has no real relation to us, and we assume there's a self on the other end, we're going to see a lot of dimensions of communication in any UAP event that we're often neglecting when we just think about the UAP as objects. Now, a very good example of this is that in most well-gathered UAP reporting that doesn't just concern lights or orbs, witnesses do describe UAP as structured vehicles. And often the elements or the aspects of the vehicle that they discuss are things you would presume would be there if you had something like a biological or similar to a biological being using these things as vehicles. For example, reports of windows were very common during the Cold War. Now, some people say that's because UAP morphed themselves to our expectations. That's a little too complicated for me. I want to take a simple path with this and say that if we're believing the witnesses that the vehicles are there, we can't suddenly say we don't believe them about the things they attribute to the vehicles. Well, you don't need a window if you don't need to look out and get a view on something. The same goes for things like doors, the same goes for appendages that would allow you to land and so on. And I'm not saying that that suffices for understanding what these things are, but all those aspects of what witnesses report, that communicates something to us. It tells us something about whoever designed or operates these things, and it allows us to make possibly some valid inferences about them. So that's one kind of communication. Another kind of communication, and I think we've sorely neglected this because we don't think about UAP relationally, is something that might be explicit communication. Now, we think about this a lot with respect to nuclear events, where we know that UAP have taken a great interest in nuclear weapons, the development of nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, nuclear research, nuclear energy systems and naval vessels. I mean, I think most everybody in this audience knows about this, but we take a very general view of that, which is that something about nuclear weapons makes us of interest to them. I think we could get a little more refined, a little more subtle about that, and start to ask ourselves, do specific UAP events that we know of, did they have, were they communicating something to basically designated recipients who would understand the message? One case that we don't think about a lot in this regard is the 1952 flyovers of Washington, D.C. Those took place in July. Well, November of that year was the first test of the hydrogen bomb. The question is, were there people within the Truman administration at the time who were apprised of UAP presence, also making decisions about when and how those tests were carried out, that wouldn't have just got the message. They might have actually known about other messages and anticipated such messages. Now, I'm not saying that happened or didn't happen. I'm not trying to do conspiracy theory. I'm saying we need to ask questions like that if we're going to make more sense of what's going on with UAP. We know from people like Jacques Vallée that it is extremely rare for a UAP event to be random. Usually the events take place in ways that seem to be targeted to the observer. And we have abundant evidence for that with some of the most well-known cases. The Nimitz event, for example, perhaps that was an accident, but there was communication in that event in which we know the vehicle went to a classified rendezvous point that it couldn't have picked up through monitoring radio communication. It was known only to the pilots through being given in writing or orally. So, if we assume that about UAP vehicles, we should assume that there's higher level, more social communication taking place that may have to do with historical events and things we're doing as human beings.
Right. Of course, we can't know, but you're saying that we need to ask the questions and really look into that and see if there's patterns as well. So maybe we don't have that much time left, so maybe we could move into the question about the experiencer community and the people. So we've talked about communication on a sort of a bigger scale, but there are countless individuals, and there's a lot of data that's been collected, for decades about people who have actually had close encounters with beings or with craft, but it takes us to another level of the possibility of people who say they've had direct communication with the entities themselves, and very credible people. So how would you integrate that into the scenario that you're talking about?
As a scholar and an academic, I want to be very kind of reserved about how I talk about that. I don't think it's would be useful or responsible of me to say, okay, all of that is real because people say so. At the same time, it would be totally irresponsible of me to say we shouldn't believe people who we believe about other weird things, okay? Because many of the same people that are giving us UAP event reports that we consider credible, including people here, are also experiencing the sorts of things you're talking about, where they're claiming to encounter what has been called in the little scientific literature we have, the occupants of the vehicles. Now, as an anthropologist, it's very normal for me to talk to people and study the statements of people who believe things that are considered odd or bizarre or who are existing at the margins of society. That's something anthropologists do. We tend to be the people in the academy who aren't afraid to get our hands dirty with people, but also with weird things. So from the perspective of an anthropologist, there's no reason not to study what experiencers are saying have happened to them when they've encountered the so-called occupants. The question is, what do we do with that? I would say that we're at a point where we have to slowly begin to have a public conversation or a larger public conversation about those claims. It needs to be based on something I'd like to frame as social trust. I think that we can't have a conversation about UAP anyway unless we're trusting other individuals, and we're also having enough trust that institutions function in good faith, that you can trust scientific authority, you can trust good faith action in government, and so on. So if we have an atmosphere of trust, I think we can start to listen to people whose accounts of this have been totally neglected. I know even here there are a lot of people that would say, okay, fine, UAP, I'm enthusiastic, but the claims of experiencers strike me as totally crazy, or they're too much for me. I would challenge all of us, including myself, to lend a greater ear to what the experiencers are saying. If we accept that there's a UAP presence, we have to consider and entertain the possibility that the reports of what appear to be biological beings may actually just be accurate. Maybe they're not biological beings, maybe they're post-biological, as some people say, maybe they're material simulations created to interact with us, who knows? But I think we have to take that very seriously right now. Now, I would suggest the way to take it seriously in a public conversation is to do it with a lot of restraint, a lot of sobriety, because we know if we're willing to think about that, our imaginations are already primed for purpose. But restraint helps set the public tone so that people can listen, but also so that we don't deceive ourselves. I think that what has happened, both because of UAP secrecy, but also the extreme stigma and marginalization of the entire topic, is a lot of us who have followed this for years were forced into a position of thinking about this not just privately and outside the public eye, but basically, in the recesses of our own mind, where we formed all sorts of ideas about what we thought was true. And as we start to investigate this better, some of the things we think are true will prove to be false. That's just going to be inevitable, and that's going to be a tough thing to take if you've spent 10 years thinking this is one way and it turns out to be another. But on the other hand, I think imaginative but also sober investigation will allow us to really begin to see some things that we've neglected. Even those of us who are very interested in this, they concern the very question of what's true in the accounts of experiencers about this.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think one approach that may be a good starting point in some scenarios, if we're trying to be gradual about it, is the cases in which there are medical effects on people as a result of close encounters, and that they've been studied by medical doctors, and there's actual data that shows how they've been impacted, and that data tells us something about the nature of the phenomenon that caused the injuries because of the study of the injuries themselves. And some of those cases have been documented and written about already. So I think that's a sort of one testament to the reality of these close encounters. When you have some kind of physical effect like that, it's harder for people to deny it. It becomes a little less subjective that way. I don't know if you'd agree, but.
Well, I personally know a lot less about that and have struggled to find where the really good, if there is any medical data on that is. I think it's out there. It's not something that you're going to find in medical journals. But what I would say to kind of close is that certainly anything being picked up from experiencers by psychiatrists, psychotherapists, other people in therapeutic professions, that is utterly valid data. And the fact that people are affected by these experiences psychologically, doesn't matter if they're organic effects. That means there's some kind of event, and what we're trying to do is untangle the part of it that fits within reality as we've defined it and as we experience it, and the part of it that exceeds reality. I think just like with UAP, with experiencer data, part of the problem is that we're dealing with something that doesn't squeeze into reality as we think it is. And we're going to have to challenge ourselves responsibly to start to rethink reality. But that's a slow process, so no need to rush it. It's something we can do slowly, by pondering and just experimenting and tinkering with the very way we think. Thank you.
Thank you.